Greetings, vibrant viewers, and welcome to Healthy Living for today's program, Preventing and Reversing Heart Disease with Caldwell B. Esselstyn, M.D. Dr. Esselstyn is a pioneer in the use of a pure, plant-based diet to help heart patients regain happy, healthy lives. Dr. Esselstyn, who began his medical career in 1956, won a Bronze Star for his services as a surgeon for the U.S. military in Ao Loc, Vietnam. From 1968 to the present, he has worked at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, USA. He is also past president of the American Association of Endocrine Surgeons, became the first recipient of the Benjamin Spock Award for Compassion in Medicine in 2005, and has been listed as one of the best physicians in the United States. His greatest contribution to the health sciences started when he began a 20-year peer-reviewed study which found that a plant-based diet can help heart disease patients. His findings are summarized in his book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. We welcome Dr. Esselstyn on today's show to explain his effective program.
My story sort of actually began from being a chairman of our breast cancer task force, because in the late 1970s, early 1980s, I was extremely frustrated with the fact that no matter how many of these operations I was doing for women, there was not one single thing that I was doing for the next unsuspecting victim. And this finally led to a search of the world's literature. And it was apparent even then that in nations like Kenya, breast cancer was 20 times less frequent than in the United States. And in rural Japan, it was very, very infrequently seen in the 1950s. And yet, when the Japanese women would migrate to the United States, by the second and third generation, they now had the same rate of breast cancer as their Caucasian counterpart. And even more compelling, perhaps, was cancer of the prostate. When you look at the entire nation of Japan, in 1958, how many autopsy-proven deaths were there from cancer of the prostate? In the entire nation, 18. Wow. That is probably one of the most mind-boggling public health figures that I'm aware of. And yet by 1978, 20 years later, they are up to 237, which still pales to the 29,000 deaths that there will be from prostate cancer in this country this year. Well, as powerful as that was, I really chose to look at cardiovascular disease, which was the leading killer of women and men in Western civilization, because as part of this review, it was apparent that there were entire cultures that absolutely never experienced cardiovascular disease or heart attacks. Even today, if you look at the rural Chinese, the Papua Highlanders in New Guinea, Central Africa, the Tarahumara Indians in northern Mexico, if you're a heart surgeon and you go there expecting to earn a living, you better plan on selling pencils. So with that sort of background, it became very exciting and very compelling to see if it wouldn't be appropriate to apply this information, this background, to patients in this country who were severely ill with cardiovascular disease, because if we could get them to consume the same type of plant-based nutrition that was characteristic of these cultures that were virtually free of cardiovascular disease, perhaps not only could we arrest the disease, but there was always this haunting possibility that we could reverse the disease. And so that, in essence, was the background. And then I ended up going to our department of cardiology at the Cleveland Clinic in the summer of 1985, after I'd done it myself for a year and really felt confident with the fact that I could do it. I was kind of interested in this myself because my dad had had his first heart attack at age 43.
Wow.
So at that point, I received the cooperation of the Department of Cardiology, asking for 24 patients that were quite ill with cardiovascular disease, with the coronary artery disease. And the idea was to not to do their cardiology, of course, but I was simply going to be somebody who counseled them in plant-based nutrition to see if we couldn't take away from their plate, as it were, absolutely any food that was at all contributing to their cardiovascular illness. So I had these 24 patients who had failed their first or second bypass operation. They had failed their first or second angioplasty. They were too sick for these procedures, or they had refused. And 5 of the 24 had been told by expert cardiologists they would not live out the year. And I'm happy to say that all 5 of those have lived beyond 22 years. So the next challenge was the rock upon which this study was most likely to fail or flounder would be lack of patient compliance.
Dr. Esselstyn reveals that a factor in helping the patients to adopt and stay on the diet was frequent and direct involvement with him as their physician and counselor.
And so for the first 5 years of the study, I saw every patient myself every 2 weeks, went over every morsel they ate, did their blood work, checked their weight and their blood pressure. The second 5 years, every 4 weeks. And so we were still seeing them on a pretty regular basis. At the end of 10 years, they were all pretty well, by this time, on autopilot. And so I was seeing them quarterly, which is still quite a bit more than the average physician sees their cardiology patients once or twice a year. Yeah. And that's when we completed our 12-year study, and then we looked them all up again at 8 years later to bring it up beyond 20 years. I had published this multiple times in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and then finally thought it was time to write a book for the public, because I think it had proved several things. We had proved that patients who were severely ill with heart disease, when properly instructed, would be willing to adopt to a significant lifestyle change that would not only eradicate their disease, but would also achieve reversal, as we'll see. That these patients also were willing to change, not for 3 months, not for 1 year, but actually to do this really for the rest of their lives. Because the thing that became so powerful in the eyes of the patients, their awareness was the fact that, look, I have now become the locus of control for this disease. Because there's nothing that a patient with heart disease or who's had a previous heart attack fears more than, when is the other shoe going to fall? When do I get the next heart attack? The families feel the same way. But just imagine how powerful it is when they recognize, when they continually follow this type of plant-based nutrition, that all that inflammation, all that formation of these ugly fatal plaques in their arteries is going to cease, diminish, resolve, go away, and they're there.
So could you explain to us, just in layman's terms, what happens? Why does somebody get a heart attack? What happens to their arteries at that time?
The first thing that happens when you're eating this typical Western diet in Europe and America is that certain blood elements become very sticky. These delicate little cells that line the artery have a name. The endothelial cells, they get sticky. Platelets, which are a clotting factor in the blood, become sticky. Your bad LDL cholesterol molecule becomes sticky. And so that's the first thing that happens. And then gradually what occurs is, with all this stickiness, the bad cholesterol molecule creeps underneath these endothelial cells, and a great deal of inflammation begins to develop. And the inflammation culminates in these very, very rascally cells that I sort of call the Darth Vader of the plaque. And those are a thing called the foam cell, which are really nothing more than white blood cells that are filled, gobbling up this bad LDL cholesterol that has crept under the endothelial cells. So what are the foam cells? What do those Darth Vaders do that's so bad? Well, they manufacture a lot of very, very aggressive inflammatory enzymes which erode the cap over the plaque. They erode the cap over the plaque, and at some place in the plaque, the cap becomes as thin as a cobweb. We now have the sheer force of blood running over that thinned out cobweb, whew, and it tears. Now, when that cap has torn, we call that a plaque rupture. And plaque rupture means that there's an opportunity for the extrusion, or the oozing out of, if you will, of plaque content out into the flowing blood. And now what happens is you have activated the platelets, the clotting factor. So as this material oozes out into the flowing blood, we now go to B, because we now have the formation of a clot trying to repair this ruptured plaque. And interestingly enough, this clot that is forming here is self-propagating. So often, in a matter of minutes from the time the plaque is ruptured, we have this clot forming here, and then bingo, suddenly the clot is now extended all the way across the artery. No time for collateral to develop. And all of the downstream muscle, which is being fed by this artery, is deprived of its oxygen and nutrients, and it dies. So either we have a heart attack, or if it's large enough, or if there's a fatal arrhythmia, then we'll have a death. So this is how 90% of heart attacks occur. This whole series also tells us how it is that these patients never, ever have to have a heart attack. Never have to have a heart attack. Why? Because if you eat and behave in a way with your nutrition that you never make those Darth Vader cells that I call the foam cells, you never get that sequence of events, then you can make it so that you can absolutely strengthen the cap over any plaque that you have. And once the cap is strengthened and the plaque cannot rupture, you have made yourself heart attack proof.
So people who have eaten animal products, animal protein, meat in the past, when they just quit eating, completely quit eating these things that cause the plaque to form, then the body can heal over the plaque and prevent a heart attack.
Totally.
Completely.
Absolutely.
What if you kept eating like just once in a while on like holidays, meat?
That's a good question. To answer that, I'd like to back up to a little bit of the work by Robert Vogel, who's a professor of cardiology at the University of Maryland. And this is obviously another picture of an artery that is filled with plaque, which you see outlined here, filled up with a lot of this cholesterol and fat. And again, I'm emphasizing how important these little cells that are one layer thick that line the artery are. These are the endothelial cells. And the endothelial cells manufacture a very powerful and very valuable substance to protect us from heart disease, and that's called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide has a number of functions, the most important of which is that nitric oxide causes the healthy artery, and all arteries, to dilate, to widen, to be able to carry more blood. And so that's a very, very key function. Nitric oxide also prevents the cells from ever getting sticky. When you're eating the typical Western diet that is high in animal fats, dairy, oils, you get this stickiness of cellular elements in the bloodstream, which makes your blood flow more like it's going through Velcro rather than through Teflon. And so nitric oxide stops things from getting sticky. Nitric oxide also inhibits formation of these plaques. Nitric oxide also can help to kill off foam cells.
Wow.
Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. You've told us that we have these wonderful endothelial cells making all this fine nitric oxide, and if I've got all these endothelial cells making nitric oxide, how come I get heart disease in the first place? And this is where Dr. Vogel from the University of Maryland and his team and others throughout the world now have given us a great contribution because of a test that they've developed. Dr. Vogel did a thing called the brachial artery tourniquet test. And in simple terms, the test consists of an ultrasound probe being placed over your brachial artery, and you'll get a reading. You'll get a certain diameter. Then for 5 minutes, a blood pressure cuff will encircle your upper arm, inflated above systolic blood pressure, so that for 5 minutes there is zero blood flow to your forearm. Then the cuff is released. And you remeasure the diameter of the brachial artery. And in the healthy, normal setting, the artery will dilate 50%. Now, Vogel did a brilliant thing. He and his team took a group of young subjects to a certain fast food restaurant. One half of the group got cornflakes. Their brachial artery tourniquet test stayed normal. The other group had hash browns and sausages. 120 minutes after the meal, they were unable to dilate their artery with the brachial artery tourniquet test.
After just one meal?
One meal.
One meal.
Well, after, what would it be, 5 or 6 bites? And what had happened was that the products of the hash browns and the sausage, that meat, that saturated fat, had so assaulted, had so injured the endothelium that it couldn't make enough nitric oxide to dilate the artery. And I think that we can both imagine that although those young subjects have recovered a number of hours after that meal of hash browns and sausage, and the brachial artery tourniquet test eventually may return to normal, just imagine the next morning they're going to have scrambled eggs and bacon. At lunch they may have white bread with mayonnaise and cold cuts. And for supper they'll probably have baked potato, sour cream, vegetables soaked in butter, lamb chops, ranch dressing, and maybe ice cream for dessert. Well, just think of the absolute assault and injury to the endothelium.
The effects of the Western diet, heavy in cooked fats and animal products, have become so detrimental to the health of people consuming it that today even young people have heart conditions that would have been seen only in the middle-aged and elderly 100 years ago.
Really is no great surprise why it is that when we start examining the carotid artery to the brain in our 12-year-olds, we already begin sickening. We know that, for instance, when our late teenager or 19 or 20 years old, those young GIs are Korea and Vietnam, fully 80% already have gross evidence of coronary artery disease. And if in a more recent study in the civilian population of those who have died of accidents, the disease is ubiquitous. Even in the 16-year-old woman, you see early evidence of coronary artery disease. And last spring, when I was moderating a panel in Los Angeles, one of our participants was Dr. Lewis Culler. Dr. Culler is the professor of public health at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. And as a result of his 10-year cardiovascular health study, he made the following statement. He said that all males who were 65 and all females who were 70 who have been exposed to the traditional Western diet have cardiovascular disease and should be treated as such. So we have this absolutely crazy situation where literally this Western diet is marching us all up to the edge of the cliff. And medicine is busy trying to rescue people as we sort of start to fall over the cliff.
Dr. Esselstyn believes the key is in informing people about the risk factors contributing to heart disease.
Why are we asking everybody to know about risk factors? Because we're all being exposed to something that is putting it at such tremendous risk that eventually we're all going to have this horrible disease, which is absolutely crazy when we see other cultures on the planet that don't even have this. So obviously the answer is, listen, stop eating the foods that give you this disease. And not only do you not get the disease, but if you've got the disease, it's a marvelous treatment for it, and it can stop it from extending. What it really requires for the public is just simply the knowledge that this hideous disease, our number one killer, it need never exist, and if it does exist, it need never ever progress.
Current approaches to cardiovascular disease involve expensive surgery and medicine, which may have many side effects. However, with Dr. Esselstyn's approach, patients with inoperable cardiovascular disease have proven to control, reverse, and even cure themselves with a plant-based diet.
A lot of physicians don't realize that this is a disease you can absolutely halt in its tracks, and you can even reverse it. Let's just take an example of a good close friend and a colleague of mine, Dr. Joseph Crow, and in 1996, he began to get some chest pain, and his cholesterol was 156. He was not overweight. He had no strong family history. He was not a smoker. He was not diabetic. He did not have high blood pressure, all these risk factors. And cardiology evaluated him and really didn't find anything that was wrong in October of 96. But 2 weeks later in November, he was finishing his surgical schedule, and he was writing post-operative orders when he suddenly began feeling pressure in his chest, and eventually it got to be just like an elephant was sitting on his chest with quite severe pain in his shoulder and down his arm. Dr. Crow was having a heart attack. So he was immediately taken down to the angiography core laboratory, and they started his catheterization to see where he had this with this blockage. And the interesting thing was that they found that he had pretty good arteries, except the entire lower one-third of his left anterior descending artery, which was the main artery to the front of the heart, was normal down to here, and then it was quite moth-eaten and diseased. And as they started this angiogram, he had a little cardiac arrest, which they resuscitated him, and he got over that. And when they finished, he had another cardiac arrest, and they resuscitated him. And then he was fine. 3 days later, it all stabilized. But he was very depressed about this because they did not do any angioplasty or any bypass for him, because his disease was over far too long a segment to allow him to have any angioplasty or stent. It was too far down the artery to be able to have a bypass. So Ann and I had him out to the house 2 weeks at the completion that is 2 weeks after his heart attack. And I said, look, Joe, you know, you've got this typical American disease. You've been eating this horrible Western diet.
But he thought he was pretty healthy, right?
Oh, yeah. I said, you know, you really got to consider going plant-based. We've got over 10 years of data.
Wow.
And he said, well, they really couldn't do anything else for me. I'll give it a try. But he said, I just am not going to take any of those cholesterol-lowering drugs because I'm worried that they might have some side effects.
Yeah.
Well, for the next 30 months, he was the absolute personification of commitment to the plant-based diet. And his total cholesterol went from 156 to 89.
Wow.
His bad cholesterol went from 98 to 38. And then, at the end of 30 months, he had another angiogram. Now, my office door was $3 down from him, and on the noontime of the day that he had his repeat angiogram, I went down and stepped into his office, and he said, Joe, could you share with me what happened on the repeat angiogram? And he got up and gave me a bit of a hug and he said, hey, I'm cured. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, tell me about it. He said, yeah, you cured me. I said, I did nothing. I'm a cheerleader. You did this. I said, any chance I could see the angiograms? And he said, sure. And so I think if you look carefully here, you can see that here was his disease 30 months earlier when he had his heart attack, and here was his disease 30
that
months
looks
later.
like totally like he never even had any problems at all.
Yeah, but it proves the point that there'll be many, many other degrees of reversal of maybe 10%, 20%, or 30%.
So
you have to remember,
all he did was just change his diet to a plant-based diet.
That's exactly right.
He didn't even take any of the cholesterol medication that was available. So this is just plant-based diet.
Yeah.
Has completely reversed.
That's the message. Throughout history, there have been entire cultures that have literally lived for generations and generations without ever having this type of disease. And that is with plant-based nutrition. And I think to use that knowledge and that skill and employ it now for patients who have been devastated by this disease is entirely appropriate, because they then become the locus of control for this disease. Right now, we have this peculiar way of treating the disease where we don't treat the disease. We use a thing called angioplasty. If you get a narrowing, we try to come in with a balloon and blow it up.
Wow.
Or we try to bypass it. They don't treat the disease. They are what we call sort of stopgap. Even the persons that do these procedures will agree that these are sort of a stopgap patch job. And the sad thing is, with stents and with angioplasty and with bypass, with the passage of time, there is an erosion of the benefits, and the whole process is extremely expensive. But when you're simply switched to eating plant-based foods, and you do it correctly, there is no morbidity or complications to the diet. You don't die from the diet. There's no added expense because you've got to eat. And the most exciting thing of all is that the benefits do nothing but continue to improve, not erode.
Wow.
Dr. Esselstyn explains the foundations of a healthy plant-based diet, which proves to be sufficient in meeting nutritional protein requirements.
When people first start this way, they can understand the causation of heart disease. They can understand that the small changes in how you eat immediately destroy the capacity of the artery to cause all this nasty inflammation, which is causing the disease. The constant question we get is, how am I going to get my protein? Well, you're never going to be deficient in protein if you're eating a wonderful variety of whole grains, all the different wonderful types of beans, vegetables, and fruit. Especially the key here for patients who, for instance, who have chest pain or angina, they have to get their green leafy vegetables. How many people do I counsel with heart disease who can tell me on a regular basis that they're eating bok choy, Swiss chard, kale, collard greens, beet greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, Napa cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, cilantro, parsley, and spinach?
That sounds delicious. In your experience in 20 years of counseling patients to go to this plant-based diet, has anyone ever had a protein deficiency?
No, not in our experience with what we've done.
There is the misconception that fish is a healthy meat alternative, but many studies have shown that fish absorb all the contamination in our waterways. So fish flesh is laced with toxins such as mercury, PCBs, DDT, dioxins, lead, arsenic, and a range of other chemicals. Warnings have been issued about the toxins found in fish flesh, and countless research has shown that consuming contaminated fish can have serious health consequences.
A piece of muscle, whether it paws with a hoof, flaps a wing, or wiggles a fin. All muscle is made up of animal protein, animal cholesterol, animal fat, none of which we really want our patients to have. Fish is this whole business about omega-3 fatty acids. And we really are not basically deficient in omega-3 fatty acids. How does the fish get omega-3? From the algae. I'm not saying that our patients are going to get algae, but you can certainly get the green leafy vegetables, and by utilizing the flaxseed meal, this is going to give us the omega-3 we need.
According to Dr. Esselstyn, the medical profession is seeing changes where doctors are increasingly interested in learning more about nutrition to better assist their patients towards a more healthful lifestyle.
Just in the last 18 months, I've had invitations from 6 different medical schools. Even though this has been going on 20 years, what happened? All these academic institutions are now beginning to really grasp and want to take advantage of this. We have to have a seismic revolution in health. The seismic revolution in health that is going to occur is going to come when we in medicine have the skill and the fortitude and the will to share with the public what is the healthiest lifestyle so they never have to have these common chronic killing diseases. If you're eating plant-based, how are you going to have obesity? How are you going to get diabetes? How are you going to get hypertension? How are you going to get strokes and heart disease, the common Western cancers, and on and on and on it goes. So there's an increasing awareness of the power of this for the most common killer, which is heart attacks, cardiovascular disease. Let's take one other organ that I think I'd like to talk about for a moment, and that is the brain. I mean, we've talked about the heart, but nothing is quite as important, because we all know now, for instance, that by age 85, 50% of Americans have dementia. Well, who wants to have a successful life and look forward to that? And there's been some very interesting developments. We know from the work of Megan Cleary and her team of radiologists from the West Coast, when they reported in 2001, in February, at the stroke meetings in Miami, that she and her team had looked at over 11,000 MRIs of the brains of Americans. That is a magnetic resonance image. And what they began to find is that at age 50 in Americans, they begin to see little white spots. What you're looking at here is a nice normal brain MRI. The only white spots you see here are the cerebral ventricles, which have cerebral spinal fluid, and that's normal. But it's a nice sort of uniformly dark area. Now, these little white spots that they're beginning to see in Americans at age 50, we now know are little strokes. Whether you're driving your car, playing tennis, sleeping, Zappo, little stroke. Not a problem, right? Because the brain's got a lot of reserve and the stroke is small. But if you continue to eat the same way and the same lifestyle, now you're 65. And you may find yourself more often than not saying, sweetheart, where'd I leave the car keys? And now you continue to eat the same way and you're 75. And you find yourself more often than not saying, sweetheart, where'd I leave the car? And now, if you continue to eat the same way and you're 85, you may look at her and say, are you my sweetheart?
So they recognized a correlation between diet and strokes. And stroke.
So wow. Here you have somebody. Gosh. I think you can see the difference in these two. In this one, I actually have counted over 90 of these little strokes. Well, you can just imagine if a brain has all these multiple little strokes and scar tissue, how can all those beautiful messages get through in a coordinated fashion? And so we think that there can be a great deal lessening of the problems of senile dementia when people begin to eat plant-based. And not only do they save the vessels in their heart, but they also save the vessels in their brain. The same is true of your legs and your kidneys and everything else. All the vessels in the body are helped.
So it sounds like there's a lot of medical research now that is proving that a plant-based diet can not only prevent diseases but elongate your health. Is that true?
The main thing is not to have this long period of chronic, debilitating diseases and illness that need never occur. And I think this is the thing that we're constantly striving for, is equality. This is Dr. Crow's at the time of his heart attack here, and then we see 30 months later what he had done without any operation or without any drugs.
Wow.
Just his own biochemistry that was so changed when he began fully eating plant-based, and kept his cholesterol, as you know, well under 150, and his bad LDL under 80. And that was my excitement and reason for wanting to write this book.
People who feel healthy and have no history of heart disease, would you still recommend them to have a plant-based diet, to switch to that?
Dr. Culler from the University of Pittsburgh, who as a result of his cardiovascular health study had said that all males who are 65, all females who are 70, who have been exposed to the traditional Western diet, have cardiovascular disease and should be treated as such. So even the person that asks you that question at age 50, let's say it's a woman who's 50 who is pretty good health, and but she's eaten the typical Western diet. I've told you already from the autopsy studies of those between the ages of 16 and 34 that that woman who's asking me the question already has a certain amount of disease. More recently, the world-famous Framingham study out of Boston, near Boston, made an observation of people in the village of Framingham that they had 1,000 people who had normal blood pressure at age 50. Those same people by age 70, 90% were now hypertensive, had high blood pressure. And so the plant-based nutrition is wonderful to help control hypertension, especially when you eliminate the salt.
We have some gifts we'd like to share with you. Supreme Master Ching Hai has written a couple of books on the life of animals. And the way that they're connected with a plant-based diet is that not only is it a very healthy way to live your life, but also it's a very loving way to live for other animals. And as you can see, one of the things that we have on our alternative living message is change your life, change your heart, change your diet. And it seems like you have not only proven that you're changing your heart to be more compassionate, but you're literally changing the chemistry and the physical part of your heart, and you're literally opening it up.
Well, thank you. I have to confess, all of my research was strictly motivated to help people. And I guess the way I look at the whole animal situation is that if we have more and more man, the two-legged creature, eating plant-based, well, that'll help his four-legged brethren.
We thank Dr. Esselstyn for his remarkable work and research in how to maintain our health through a plant-based diet. We wish him the best of success and health.